Welcome and good day to this webinar. My name is Nicola Bock. I'm events lead at Agora Think Tanks and welcome you very much to today's event. On 4th May, so 3 weeks ago, Agora Energiewende published the report Breaking Free from Fossil Gas, a new path to a climate neutral Europe. It does present a structural transition pathway away from fossil gas by 2050. And it's based on detailed sectoral modeling on the energy, the industry, and the buildings sectors. While on the publication day, so on 4th May, we presented an overview and the main findings of the report in a webinar. And by the way, you can still watch the recording on our website. We'd now like to dive in more deeply into the 3 sectors covered. And today we're going to start with the deep dive power and supply, for which Artelys did the modeling. In the webinar, we will start with a short overview of the study by Muriel Gagnebin, who is Senior Associate for EU and French Energy Policy at Agora Energiewende and co-author of the study. And her introduction will then be followed by a presentation of Artelys. And then we have all the time for our Q&A session, which I already announced. And I ask you again to make use of it, use the Q&A box, put all your questions in there so we can have a good discussion at the end of the webinar. The foreseen end of it is 12:30 when we will send you to lunch or to whatever food is due then, depending on the time zone you are in. And now let me ask Muriel to switch on the camera so I can hand over to you. And I wish everyone a good event.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you for the introduction. Welcome everyone to our second webinar for this new study we have published, as said by Nicola a few weeks back, Breaking Free from Fossil Gas, a New Path to a Climate Neutral Europe. So I'm going to share my screen now. I will be presenting shortly an overview of the study first, before passing it over to my colleagues from Artelys, Paul Brière and Christopher André, who took care of the modeling for Artelys side and will be presenting the more technical aspects of this study. So for those who have heard it already, apologies, just the project scope as a reminder for those who do not really know exactly what the study is about. So we have modeled a decarbonization pathway until 2050, for the EU 27, considering Russian gas phase out as quickly as possible. So actually this project started 2 years ago already, and we had started with modeling scenarios. But as you know, last year we had a dramatic change in situation, and especially considering gas consumption, fossil gas consumption supply for Europe, it became another level of discussion and debate on how to reduce our consumption as quickly as possible. So we took into account additional constraints in the modeling work, the idea being reducing consumption by 40% by 2027 already, which amounts pretty much to what Europe has been importing from Russia in the past 10 years. We decided to also focus only on demand reductions that are long-lasting, meaning structural demand reductions, and not relying on behavioral changes, for example, for one reason that we don't know how long those behavioral changes can last. What we wanted to do and show with the modeling work was how we can concretely reduce gas consumption in the long term by making the right investments and making the right decisions today and have it stable over time. We also, so the optimization was cost-driven mostly. And we have balanced between direct electrification wherever possible, but also the use of hydrogen. You will see later on in the messaging that we will see some hydrogen, but a bit later in the transition. The details of the modeling work will be presented by my colleagues from Artelys, but overall, we have modeled the sector's power, buildings, and industry in 5-year steps. and also the infrastructure between the countries and storage, for example, but not the national infrastructure. So transmission line and distribution grids within the countries have not made model. It's a very dedicated, specific work that would need to be done separately. For the other sectors, transport, agriculture specifically, we haven't covered them through modeling work because, well, mostly they don't consume gas. And so we have integrated existing scenarios from other organizations. We have modeled the energy system in the EU country by country, especially so TEP Energy did the work on the building sector, Wuppertal Institute took over the industry sector, and the power sector and energy supply in general was taken over by Artelys, who will be presenting this section specifically. We will have separate dedicated webinars as well for the buildings and industry sector a bit later. We have also actually in this context decided to work with 9 partners in rather Eastern European countries, where we looked into the assumptions in more details in all those sectors that we have modeled. You see the partners I'm talking about on the right side of the screen. So in those countries, we have looked into the details of the assumptions and discussed the results as well, which is not necessarily the case for the other European countries, for example. So please keep in mind it's a European optimization that will obviously have an impact on the results, which I'm very happy to present now. To also explain maybe how the whole modeling worked and between the different consultants we have worked with, basically we have to simplify defined carbon budgets until 2050 that could be realistically achieved in the 3 sectors that we have modeled. And TEP Energy for the building sector, Wuppertal Institute for the industry sector have modeled energy demand to keep those carbon budgets, so to say, and to achieve the climate targets for Europe. And this was fed into Artelys model, who in turn modeled the power sector and how to supply the energy necessary to cover the demand for energy in the buildings industry, but also then the agriculture and transport sector that were not modeled, but for which we have also energy demand input that we put into the system. Those are the technologies that we have considered. As you can see, there's quite a few. So for pretty much all the sectors, we have taken into account energy efficiency increases. We have different technologies that would allow for direct electrification, such as heat pumps in the building sector. In industry, it includes also electric furnaces, for example. The use of district heating was also considered in the buildings and industry sector to provide low and high temperature heat. Solar thermal, geothermal, biomass, be it solid or gases, and different types of gases, mostly renewables, so renewable hydrogen, e-gases, biomethane, but also SMR hydrogen with CCS was considered and taken into account in the modeling as well. In industry, I would like to mention we also took into account assumptions on circular economy, for example, to reduce primary material production that would also help saving energy. And we have the infrastructure, for example, that was modeled by Artelys in the section on energy supply. So what came out of this study overall is we can almost have actually gas consumption by 2030 already in the EU, 27, and reduce it by 90% already by 2040. And this only, so betting on structural demand reduction, so no behavioral changes were taken into account. And we also considered industrial output to remain pretty much at the same level as it is today. So there is no displacement of production that was considered, which is an easy way, so to say, to reduce energy consumption and gas specifically in the industry. And this is all done ensuring security of supply for each of the hours that were modeled in the years that were modeled. With them also measures, if we implemented the right measures today already and made the investments that are necessary, we could also phase out Russian gas consumption, so about 40% of past European consumption by 2027 at the latest, and reduce our dependence on fossil gas also very quickly. So as you can see here, Russian gas imports are in dark blue. So we could actually take it off between 2025 and 2030. And by almost 2045 already, we could actually completely supply the remaining methane demand with biogas and biomethane production that's actually produced in Europe, which improves the energy sovereignty for Europe as well. This has an impact, obviously, also on GHG emissions. So in our scenario, the results are about 60% emissions reduction already by 2030, which is doable thanks to all this electrification, a strong focus on it, and fossil gas not being used as a gap to fill the gap to replace other kinds of energy such as oil or coal. But we see in our scenario as well a demand reduction in all those other fossil fuels. So it's not that fossil gas reduction comes at the cost of other fossil fuels. Everything is being reduced, which also allows to, that's why being quite quick in emissions reduction by 2030 already. And we could achieve almost 90% emissions reduction by 2040 already and achieve the climate targets for net neutral, net zero emissions by 2050 already for the EU 27. We show also that we can achieve those targets also by 2030 without necessarily replacing fossil gas with alternatives. What we say is we can, through direct electrification, the right investments, reduce gas consumption, fossil gas consumption, and by prioritizing direct electrification properly, we could need actually quite a limited amount of hydrogen until 2030 in the first place. The use of hydrogen would increase later on in specifically sectors that need it the most. It's a costly energy vector to produce, especially through renewable electricity, etc. We need the electricity in other sectors as well. So we compared it to the plan proposed in the REPowerEU plan and discussed right now at the EU level, and that are setting some form of reference in terms of hydrogen production targets for 2030 already. And we are much lower than what is expected at the in the plan at this point. And we think there is a discussion necessary there, an impact assessment that we should be looking into the necessary hydrogen consumption in the future in more detail before committing too much money in it and having not enough eventually for other investments that are necessary. So the key policy implications are the following. So one thing is the emissions reduction by 90% in 2040 is achievable, and the EU should set this as a target in the debate that is going to start fairly soon. Also, we think the EU should fundamentally revisit the EU gas and methane package that it has been discussing in the past year, and the REPowerEU target on hydrogen and biomethane, which seem quite high to us. We need to have a strong impact assessment to see what are the trade-offs and make sure we're pushing for the right investments to avoid stranded assets in near future, actually. Also, we think the governments and the regulators should prepare for an accelerated decline in gas demand, and specifically, we'll see it later also in the presentation by Artelys. It will have an impact on gas supply infrastructure, and we need to plan this ahead of time to be able to be efficient also in terms of transition to hydrogen and power, but also in terms of stranded assets. In the building sector specifically, we think also the new fossil gas burning equipment should be stopped very quickly, and that should be before 2030. So even if they still are around in 20 years, we are actually rid of fossil gas burning equipment in buildings by 2050 at the latest. So in general, the member states should be reflecting already now the rapid phase out of fossil gas demand that was not really foreseen actually in the past years in the process of updating the national energy and climate plans for 2030, which is happening right now until next summer. So I will pass it here over to Christopher to present the methodology and go into the more technical details of the modeling work that has been carried out in the energy supply and the power sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Muriel, for the introduction. My colleague Paul, who is with me, will share the slides. In the meantime, before jumping into the presentation, I'd like to thank Agora Energiewende for the opportunity to present results, and also for trusting Artelys and its partner TEP Energy and Wuppertal Institute to deliver this very ambitious study. Today, I will be speaking about the methodology and the key assumptions behind this study, and my colleague Paul will walk you through the main results, focusing on the supply of energy, the infrastructure, and particular emphasis on the electricity sector. So you can go to the next slide, please. So as Muriel has mentioned, in order to build this pathway towards carbon neutrality, we have combined several models. First projection of final energy demands have been built by our partners, TEP Energy in the building sector and Wuppertal Institute in the industry. And we have used scenarios for the other sectors that we have not explicitly modeled ourselves, notably scenarios by transport and environment for transport and mobility. And all these assumptions have then been brought together into a consistent modeling framework, namely the Artelys Crystal Supergrid model. These solutions allow for multi-energy modeling of the European energy system. So the power, methane, and hydrogen systems in the EU27 have been modeled within this tool using a bottom-up energy modeling approach. So the different production, consumption, and transmission technologies, as well as storage, are explicitly represented, and the supply-demand balance is enforced at an hourly time resolution. The different energy carriers are explicitly modeled as well, so electricity, hydrogen, methane, biomass, as well as CO2 emissions, of course, and all the sector couplings between energy carriers are explicitly represented. Infrastructures such as electrolyzers, interconnectors, and storage assets are modeled, but we have not modeled here the internal transmission and distribution grids for all energy carriers. CCS is also considered with respect to the removal of carbon emissions, but we have not represented CO2 pipelines explicitly. And then fossil gas imports from outside the EU are also allowed in the model. They are determined based on gas cost curves that are provided by ENSOG in the TYNDP. We can go to the next slide, please. So in practice, how does it work? We have several inputs that go into the model, and these are shown on the left-hand side of this slide. The first input is the current state of the energy system. So the capacities that exist today at the beginning of the pathway, and then what is the final energy demand today for electricity, CH4 and H2. Of course, we also need to input the future projected energy demands for all these vectors. Once we have a representation of the demand, we have to input a catalog of investment options, so a set of technologies that the model can use in order to enforce the equilibrium between supply and demand, taking into account the need to enforce that equilibrium on an hourly time resolution. And then finally, we have additional constraints. And Muriel has already mentioned that we are working with carbon budgets. We have some countries that have minimum renewable development targets. We have, for some technologies, also some constraints on their deployment, namely the phase-out plans of coal or investment plans in nuclear. And we put all this into our model called Artelys Crystal Supergrid. And you can go to that. Yeah, thank you, Paul. And this performed a multi-energy capacity expansion pathway in order to understand how the different sectors evolve in order to meet the demand between 2025 to 2050 with a 5-year time step. So we optimize with this tool at the same time jointly the investment in new capacities, so in power generation, in electrolysis, in storage, in interconnectors, in transmission pipelines, etc., and the dispatch for all the energy vectors that we have represented in order to meet the demand safely at the lowest possible overall cost. From this optimization, we can extract a number of different key performance indicators, several types of indicators. So first, the kind of system level indicators, so the investment in each of the technologies for each of the time steps, and Paul will show that to you in a minute. Of course, then also the energy annual supply mix, so how these capacities are being used by the system, the hourly dispatch, the cross-border power, methane, and hydrogen flows, and imports from outside the EU. We also have some indicators related to the use rate of the different generation, transmission, and storage technologies. And finally, some indicators related to the quality of the way we can meet the demand, so loss of load and energy not served. And we also have some statistics about curtailment of renewable energy. Then we have another set of indicators more on the economic side. So the investment cost, the CapEx, the system operation cost, the OpEx, and the cost of fuel consumption. And finally, we have policy-related KPIs. So for example, the CO2 emissions by sectors, how they develop along the pathway, and also some calculation related to welfare. And just as a last word on this slide, just to mention that, as I have already mentioned, we are enforcing the supply-demand equilibrium at an hourly time resolution, and we are modeling around 40 zones in this model, so the 27 member states and neighboring countries. So you can go to the next slide. I'll now walk you through some of the key assumptions that we have used, and you will see the impact of these assumptions when Paul will present the results in a minute. So we have tried on this slide to extract the two most dimensioning constraints on the optimization of the energy supply, namely the evolution of final energy demand and the carbon budget. So if we begin by the evolution of the carbon demand, it is based on work that our partners TEP Energy and Wuppertal Institute have carried out in the context of this study, and also on third-party scenarios, namely the Road to Zero scenario by Transport and Environment for transport. We take all these different demands from the different models, and then we use them as input into the global Artelys Crystal Supergrid modeling platform in order to optimize the infrastructure and the supply of all these energy vectors. On the carbon budget approach, we have defined an overall carbon budget for the pathway that has been split into yearly carbon budgets for the different years. Then the greenhouse gas emissions of some of these sectors that have not been explicitly modeled have been kind of inherited from third-party scenarios. So for transport, we take the emissions from their scenario, and then for agriculture and waste, we are basing ourselves on European Environment Agency, and for LULUCF on European Commission datasets. It has to be mentioned that the CO2 price is not an assumption that we have to input into the model, since we put the carbon budget in as a constraint. Then, in terms of the assumptions for the power sector, we allow for, of course, investment in renewables. We consider technical and economic potentials based on the Espresso database developed by the Joint Research Center. And we have considered some amendments in terms of the potential based on expert consultations, based on the list of experts that have been interviewed and that have interacted with us during the study, and they have been mentioned by Muriel on one of the first slides. In the fossils, we start from existing capacities with decommissioning plans. Coal and lignite are forced out before 2035. And investment options in new capacities of methane and hydrogen, or CGTs and CCGTs, are allowed, but no CCS, as we didn't want this scenario to be based on kind of a silver bullet technology and have a rather conservative approach on this point. For nuclear, we have existing capacities with decommissioning plans. We have life extension reinvestment options in a number of countries, and investment options in other relevant countries that are considering nuclear investments. And then in order to meet the challenge of flexibility, we start, of course, from existing capacities, but we allow the system to invest in new cross-border transmission lines, in batteries, as well as in sector coupling technologies. And these will be emphasized on the next slide. So if we now go towards hydrogen and biogas biomethane, here I try to summarize the four main assumptions. First, in terms of production of hydrogen, the existing SMR capacities are forced out after 2030. There are investment options in new capacities of electrolyzers and SMR equipped with CCS in Europe, including Norway. And in 2030, we have a constraint on the minimum development of electrolyzer in order to meet the already announced policy targets. We then allow for pipeline and import infrastructure for hydrogen. So we allow the model to invest in new intra-European pipelines, import pipelines from Algeria, Ukraine, and Norway as well, with import costs based on a third-party study, namely the gas for climate study. And then we also allow for the repurposing of existing methane pipelines. And of course, we can have maritime import routes as well. On the storage front, we allow for investment options in new hydrogen underground storages, in a selection of countries. And finally, on the biogas and biomethane, these are considered to be interchangeable with fossil gas in the different sectors. We have adopted a conservative approach regarding their availability due to sustainability concerns of biomass overall. And the total biomass consumption is assumed to remain at today's levels at maximum. So this gives you a general idea of the framework in which we have worked, and we'll now jump into the key results that will be presented by Paul.
Paul, you muted.
Thank you. And good morning, everyone. I will walk you through the main results of our modeling work. The presentation of the results will be organized in three parts. I will first present the cross-sectoral big picture and the evolution of the energy demand. In a second step, I will present the effects on the gas, so hydrogen and methane supply system. And in a third part, I will present more in detail how the power system will evolve. So this graph shows the evolution of the final energy demand by energy carrier for EU 27. The first message that can be identified on this slide is that overall, the final energy demand will decline by 30% between 2018 and 2050, and already by 10% between 2018 and 2030. Beyond the overall decline of the energy demand, this graph also highlights the fact the major role played by electricity. Indeed, as you can see, the fossil energy carriers decline quickly at the beginning of the pathway, and the electricity is increasing over the pathway. So this final energy demand, this evolution of the final energy demand, is not a result from our model, but rather an input to our model. And based on this evolution of the final energy demand, we have optimized the upstream energy sector in order to meet at every hour of the year this energy demand in each European country. This second graph shows the evolution of the primary energy demand. So as you can see, there is no electricity anymore, for instance, because electricity is replaced by the primary energy sources used to produce this electricity. What can be seen on this graph is first the decline of fossil energy sources. Hard coal and lignite are almost entirely phased out by 2035, and oil and gas are declining and down to zero in 2050. On the other hand, the renewables are increasing strongly, and they are only accounting for 16% of primary energy demand in 2018, and they are increasing from 16% to 88% in 2050. So in 2050, most of the primary energy demand comes from renewable sources. Regarding nuclear, in gray, nuclear represents 15 to 20% of the primary energy demand from 2018 to 2045, and declines to 9% of primary energy demand in 2050. So this was the large-scale picture, cross-sectoral picture. In this second part, we will have a deeper look on the fossil gas and hydrogen system. Muriel has already presented at the beginning of the webinar the evolution of the fossil gas demand and the fossil gas supply. On this slide, I will present the evolution of the hydrogen demand, the pure hydrogen demand. So as you could expect, hydrogen demand is overall increasing over the pathway. The graph on the left shows the evolution of the hydrogen demand in EU 27 from 2018 to 2050. However, this increase of hydrogen demand can be splitted into two distinct steps. From 2018 to 2030, this increase remains low. The hydrogen demand only increases by 22% between 2018 and 2030, and hydrogen remains used in the same sectors as today, so mainly in the industry and in the refineries. And on the opposite, after 2030, the hydrogen demand will grow much faster and is almost expected to quintuple between 2030 and 2050. In terms of sectors, we can see that the industry is the main driver for the increase in the hydrogen demand between 2030 and 2040, and that after 2040, we see an important development of the hydrogen demand in other sectors, such as power generation, district heating generation, and synthetic fuels generation. So this was the demand side. Now let's have a look on the supply side. So this is the graph on the right. In 2018, the supply of hydrogen is mainly done with fossil gas, and these steam methane reforming assets are forced in our model to be decommissioned after 2030. So after 2030, our model has different investment options to meet the hydrogen demand. These different investment options are building domestic electrolyzers, which will consume electricity, build hydrogen import infrastructure, or build steam methane reforming with carbon capture. This graph highlights that the most of the hydrogen actually comes from the domestic electrolyzers, and that the domestic electrolyzers develop quite strongly. This is, however, so this was the picture for the pure hydrogen demand and supply. This is, however, only a partial view of the hydrogen landscape. And to have a holistic view of the hydrogen landscape, we have to also include the hydrogen derivatives. So this graph shows not only the hydrogen supply mix, but also includes the hydrogen derivatives supply mix. So the difference with the previous graph is that we added these two purple bars, which represent the imports of synthetic fuels and the imports of other hydrogen derivatives. And when we include the hydrogen derivatives and in the supply mix, we see that actually the import play a key role, because, well, almost a bit less than half of the hydrogen and hydrogen derivative supply mix comes from imports, the other half being domestic electrolyzers by 2050. But these imports of hydrogen only develop at the end of the pathway after 2040. Now let's have a look on the consequences of the evolution of the demand and supply of methane and hydrogen on the infrastructure. So these three maps show the methane flow through pipelines in Europe in 2030, 2040, and 2050. As you could expect, as long as the fossil gas demand and supply decreases over the pathway, the flows in the infrastructure reduces. This slides show on the opposite the evolution of the flows in the hydrogen pipeline infrastructure, and we can see that during this pathway we see increasing cross-border hydrogen flows, and especially in 2050 we see quite important flows between the countries. And the trend is that the flows come from the south of Europe and goes up to the north of Europe. And for instance, on the French-Spanish cross-border, the flow in 2050 would be higher than 160 terawatt-hour per year. This let me underline the fact that the increasing cross-border hydrogen flow represents an opportunity to reuse and make the existing methane infrastructure evolve towards new gases. In terms of LNG terminals, these two graphs show on the left the LNG terminal installed capacities by country in 2030 in our model, and on the right, the LNG terminal utilization rate by country in 2030. What appears on this map is that in some countries, the utilization rate of LNG terminal is very low already by 2030, and especially in Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Germany, the utilization rate of the LNG terminal is lower than 5%. So this means that LNG terminals currently being built in several European member states risk becoming stranded assets by 2030 already. So this was the picture for hydrogen and methane sectors. Now we will have a deeper look into the power sector, which are the main evolution. So as already mentioned, in the final energy demand graph, the electricity plays a key role in the transition that we have modeled. This slide shows the evolution of the power consumption by sector for EU 27 between 2018 and 2050. So the total electricity consumption more than doubles. It has an increase of 128% between 2018 and 2050. Looking sector by sector, so in the building sector, so residential and tertiary sector, the electricity demand remains quite stable, and this is actually the consequence of two combined effects. On the one hand, the energy efficiency measures, including building renovation, trend to reduce the electricity demand, and in the other hand, you have the electrification of heating devices, mainly through heat pumps, which lead to an increase of the electricity demand. So one in the other, power demand in the building sector remains stable between 2018 and 2050. In the industry sector, in green, the increase is significant, plus 57% between 2018 and 2050, and due to electrification of processes. But actually, the largest share of the increase is not due to the industry, but is due to the two latest sectors, hydrogen generation with electrolyzers and e-mobility. And these two sectors, which have almost no electricity consumption in 2018, are responsible for the major share of the overall power consumption increase for EU 27 between 2018 and 2050. So this was for the demand. Now let's have a look on the supply side. How is this electricity supplied? As you could expect, most of this electricity is supplied with renewables, especially wind in blue and solar in yellow. The share of electricity generated from fossils, so coal, lignite, and gas, is reduced at the beginning of the pathway. Between 2018 and 2025, the electricity generated from fossil gas is reduced by 75%. This is due to the current context and the gas prices, which are expected to remain higher than they used to be in the past 10 years. And between 2018 and 2030, the output of coal and lignite technologies is divided by 4 and is expected to be phased out by 2035. The renewables account for 69% of the total electricity generation in 2030, and account for more than 93% of the total electricity generation by 2050. So this is massive. This was the supply mix in terms of energy, so in terawatt hours. Now let's have a look on the capacities. So in megawatt, the installed capacities to generate this energy. As you could expect, the power generation mix in terms of power of installed capacities is also dominated by solar and wind. So wind reaches 480 gigawatts of installed capacities by 2030. And solar reaches 570 gigawatts by 2030. But what is important to underline on this slide is more on the capacities and on the installed capacities of dispatchable capacities. So I'm talking about coal, lignite, oil, fossil gas, and hydrogen, nuclear, and hydro. And actually, these installed dispatchable capacities decrease between 2018 and 2050, but only decrease by 25%. So it means that the decrease in the dispatchable installed capacities is much lower than the decrease in the electricity generation. So another way to say it is that actually important installed dispatchable capacities remain online, but they are used a lower number of hours in the year. So most of the dispatchable capacities will continue to exist, but the value they bring to the system will definitely be different from the value they bring today. Today, dispatchable capacities bring an energy value. They produce electricity. In the future, and by 2050, the value brought by these dispatchable capacities will be more capacity value. They will be here to provide capacity and flexibility when required, but they will run a very low number of hours in the year. Still, regarding these dispatchable capacities, we also see that from 2035 onwards, gas-powered capacity here in gray are gradually phased out and replaced by hydrogen-powered capacities. But new hydrogen-powered capacity is required to ensure the flexibility and the adequacy of the systems. The capacity installation rates, so back to the renewables, the installed capacities for the renewables increase very strongly. And on this slide, we compare the historical installation rates of renewables with average installation rates that would be required until 2050 in average to reach the installed capacities we foresee. What this graph underlines is that in order to reach the target of this study, average yearly installation rates need to be multiplied by 2.7 compared to the highest historical installation rate over the past 10 years. So this factor of 2.7 hides differences between the technologies. For instance, the factor is only 1.3 for solar, and we see indeed on this graph that we are almost already on track to reach the targets for solar. However, for wind onshore, the factor is by 2.2. So we really need to increase the rhythm of installation of new onshore wind capacities, and for offshore wind installation will also need to take off. So we've talked about the electricity demand, the electricity supply, the electricity installed capacities. One other very important point to have in mind about the evolution of a power system is the evolution of the flexibility. Indeed, electricity is not easily storable, so the supply and the demand need to fit at every time step. On this graph, we show typical weeks of demand-supply balance in winter and in summer, on the left in 2030 and on the right on 2050. Let's have a look on what happens in 2050. So in 2050, we see that in this typical winter week, at the beginning of the week, the generation with wind power capacity is quite important, and that almost 100% of the demand can be met with wind, solar, and a bit of nuclear and hydro. However, at the end of this week, the generation from wind goes down, and then hydrogen power plants come in order to meet the demand. On the demand side, now, what is interesting to notice, is the evolution of the electrolysis demand over this week. Electrolysis is this blue area. At the beginning of the week, when some renewables energy is available, the electrolyzers are operating in order to consume this available electricity. However, at the end of the week, when less electricity is available in the system due to lower wind generation, the electrolysis demand is also lower. So during this winter week, we see that the electrolysis demand is changing depending on the renewable energy available. During the summer week, what is very impressive is the variability of the electricity generation due to the very important electricity generation from solar. And on the demand side, we see that the demand also adapts to fit this available electricity, and the electrolyzers are operating at a very high load factor during the days in order to use the available solar electricity. So this shows on a few weeks how the flexibility of the power system will evolve and has to evolve in order to ensure the demand-supply balance. At a higher view, this graph shows how over the whole year, over the whole Europe, how the flexibility is provided by the different technologies. So we differentiate two types of flexibility: seasonal flexibility, the flexibility between summer and winter, and intraday flexibility. And what is shared between these two types of flexibility is the fact that in 2025, the major share of flexibility is provided on the supply side with dispatchable power plants, so coal power plants, gas power plants, nuclear power plants, and that hydro also play a role, but the flexibility at the demand side is very low. And at the end of the pathway, in 2050, the role of flexibility, the role of the supply in the flexibility is lower, and the major share of the flexibility is provided by the demand side, mainly electrolysis for the seasonal flexibility, and electrolysis as well as electric vehicles for the intraday flexibility. Now I will leave the floor to Christopher for the key messages from the power sector.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul, for walking us through the results. And I'll just conclude with the key points that Paul has mentioned on the power sector. Of course, we see a large-scale deployment of renewables in the pathway with a deployment rate that will be challenging to meet. So there will be issues to be solved around permitting, land availability, materials, supply chains, staff training, as well as public acceptance. So a number of challenges related to the deployment of renewables themselves. Then we've also seen that there will be a change in the role played by dispatchable units from baseload generation in the 2020s towards the provision of capacity and flexibility services towards the 2040s and 2050s, which begs the question of how the markets also incentivize these assets to remain online to provide these services. And finally, I wanted to stress the importance of demand flexibility. And we've seen on the different time series that Paul has shown that in order for this system to be able to match demand and supply, the demand side has to be offering flexibility, especially electric vehicle charging, but also the way electrolyzers will be running in Europe. So this also needs to be taken into account when thinking about the market design for electricity and how price signals are transferred to consumers, and what is the role of local markets, of TSO, DSO interactions, etc. So a number of challenges emerging from that picture on the power sector. And with that, I think we conclude this presentation focused on the power sector and the general energy supply, and would be happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Christopher, for your presentation. We have had a few questions coming into the Q&A, so I would suggest maybe we can start with a few. Don't hesitate to send us some other questions then on the fly. So maybe we can start with the first one that came in about variable renewable curtailment. How is it taken into account? Either Christopher or Paul.
I can perhaps take that one first, and Paul, if you want to complement, do not hesitate. Indeed, in the modeling, we are using an hourly time resolution across the entire year. So we represent the 8,760 hours of the year. And we see the time series of renewable production, and we take into account the possibility to curtail renewables, meaning that the renewable curtailment is kind of a flexibility solution in the sense that we do not have to dimension the entire system in order to integrate 100% of that renewable production, but we can allow ourselves to curtail, and so to dimension the system, in particular interconnectors, in a way not to over-dimension the system in order to exploit these tiny little bits of curtailed energy. But I think in general, renewables we see renewables becoming quite cheap, and so the curtailment of renewables is not an issue here. Of course, the different technologies, and then on the supply side, on the demand side, we'll try to also minimize the amount of renewable curtailment. You'll see, as Paul has shown, that electric vehicle charging will concentrate during certain hours, and electrolyzers also will tend to run during these hours where you have a lot of renewable into the system.
Okay, we have another question, which is about CCS. So we haven't really explicitly mentioned any modeling results on it. So Paul, I will ask you to, maybe we have one slide to share also where we have seen some CCS in a scenario and what it means.
Yes. Can you still see my screen? Yeah, okay. Yes, so indeed, some CCS is considered in our scenarios, but only in some specific sectors. So on this slide, we show the negative emissions, the stored CO2 emissions. We see that actually the CCS for the upstream energy sector plays quite a minor role, because CCS was only made possible for hydrogen generation, SMR with CCS, and we saw that the competition between green and blue hydrogen turned into the advantage of green hydrogen. So the generation of blue hydrogen remains quite low, and as a consequence, the captured and stored carbon for hydrogen generation is quite a However, some CCS was considered in other sectors, and especially in the industry sector, in the cement industry, in the iron and steel industry, and in other industries. This was not part of Artelys modeling work. This has been modeled by our partners in the modeling of the industry. But still, yes, CCS is well considered in some specific sectors.
So it's a bit linked as well, I guess. There's a question about blue and green, so renewable hydrogen. How did we take into account so this SMR plus CCS hydrogen and green hydrogen, and how was it prioritized by the model?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe I can take this one as well. So the model is an technical economic optimization. So what you put as an input are costs, capex costs, operating costs, fixed operating costs, maintenance costs, and the different technologies have to supply to buy their input energy. So for instance, for an electrolyzer, we say, okay, the model is allowed to build this amount of electrolyzers in this country, and it will cost this number of euros per installed megawatts. And additionally, the electrolyzer will have to purchase its electricity, so to buy the electricity produced by the renewables or other technologies. So we did not made any choice to prioritize the blue hydrogen over the green hydrogen. We only put the different costs of the different technologies, and the optimization decided to prioritize green hydrogen over blue hydrogen because this appeared in the model to be cheaper.
Thanks, Paul. Here, maybe a question for Christopher. What drives the hydrogen demand for power generation? Is the investment in hydrogen turbines and therefore technical assumptions a need for clean dispatchable generation?
Yeah, I can take that one. So indeed, in the model, we see some hydrogen-fired assets develop in the latest part of the pathway. And so the need to have these dispatchable assets coming online is linked to the provision of flexibility services on different timescales on the electricity side. So if we can think about the need for flexibility on different timescales, for example, Paul has mentioned short time scale flexibility. So we see different roles for different type of assets. So you can change the way you're using the demand side assets, so electrolyzer, electric vehicles, batteries. But then for longer term flexibility, of course, you cannot delay the charging of your EV too long. So the demand side is participating a little bit less. And we need to have some assets able to provide electricity during those periods where you have low renewable output and high demand. So generally speaking, during some kind of winter periods with low wind and low sun. And therefore, we see the need for hydrogen assets to develop to meet these challenges during these periods. But as Paul has mentioned, these assets are there in the system, but they tend to run for a low number of hours. They mostly provide capacity value, meaning they're there when we need it, but they do not produce it as a baseload technology at all. They're really very flexible. Hope that answers the question.
Shortly back to CCS and SMR CCS for hydrogen production, there was a question about how do we expect the risk of stranded assets and lock-in to be? But considering we have very limited amounts of it, I guess for the cost assumptions, I think this is not a huge issue, I guess, for at least this model result. Christopher or Paul, can you comment?
Yeah, indeed, that would also have been my way of answering the question. We see a limited deployment of these technologies in the model outputs, so no huge risk of lock-in in that sector. We see some risk of stranded assets in other sectors of the gas supply side or the gas infrastructure, as Paul has mentioned, in terms of the use rate of some LNG terminals. We see there a greater role of having stranded assets.
There's obviously a lot of questions around hydrogen in the power sector outside as well, but There was a question on why do we only mention hydrogen turbines in the power sector, Christopher? There are also engines, for example, fuel cells.
Yeah, we're using hydrogen turbines as kind of a generic term for hydrogen-fired assets or assets using hydrogen to produce electricity. It doesn't mean that others, such as engines or fuel cells, do not have a role here. It's just that we have chosen that wording for the slide for simplicity.
Here, one more question about hydrogen. Added under electricity, so power generation and installed capacity. There was a question about, why is it showing at all? Because we need to produce hydrogen first, and we're saying in a model where we're mostly producing hydrogen, not importing it, but parts of it is imported. So obviously, there's a reason to it.
Yes. Well, two answers. It depends on the temporality, and it depends on the location. Obviously, you will never have in our model at the same time one hydrogen turbine or whatever other device consuming hydrogen to produce electricity, and at the same time in the same country another electrolyzer consuming electricity to produce hydrogen. This makes no sense. We totally agree, and the model doesn't do that. However, it depends on the time. So it can happen that during some hours of the day, electrolyzers will consume electricity to produce hydrogen, and during other hours of the day, the hydrogen will be consumed to produce electricity, but not at the same time. And it can also happen that it happens in different countries. So even if the different countries are strongly interconnected in terms of power interconnections, the power interconnection can still be saturated at some point. And so in this case, it could happen that electrolyzers is producing hydrogen in some region of Europe, and that hydrogen turbines are running in other countries. Christopher, if you want to complete.
I think that answers the thing well. I think generally on these slides we have put all the technologies that have electricity as an output. So that's why we have both the solar and the wind power, for example, that provide electricity to electrolyzers, but also the hydrogen turbines or engines that then use that hydrogen to produce electricity themselves.
There are two questions also that I would like to take about the deployment of renewables. Obviously, we see a lot of renewables coming into the system until 2030 already, and we're in this sense in line with the REPowerEU plan announcements as well. And we have had actually exchanges with a lot of different partners, so including the partners, the national partners I mentioned earlier in the presentation that we have consulted for at the national level, but also industry organizations, for example, based in Brussels, how they see also the potential for deployment of the different technologies in the future to come. And so many of them, for example, the solar power industry says, in their scenario, actually, they're even more ambitious than what comes out in this model and in this scenario. And actually, we have seen last year a really huge increase in installation rates in solar and wind. So in solar, I think we're talking about 40 gigawatts or something that was installed in the EU 27 last year only. And this is an increasing trend. So if we keep it like that, we would actually already be achieving this deployment rate increase as we see in the report. For wind energy, obviously there is some more work to be done, be it for offshore wind. Some more things need to be implemented to simplify maybe some administrative procedures, etc. Same for onshore winds, but we still also saw quite a lot of increase last year. I think 16 gigawatts added, which is actually a very good trend already, considering the past years that were not that great in this sector. So yes, obviously it is a challenge and there's still a lot to be done, but it's not as far off as actually could have seemed maybe 2 or 3 years ago. The second question about the feasibility was about how do we take into account the challenge about supply chain, for example, as well. So obviously, this is something that the models do not do, take into account the different materials that are necessary also on top of all the modeling work that it is doing and the cost optimization it is doing. We are currently actually carrying out an additional analysis based on this scenario to analyze how much material is necessary actually to deliver on this scenario, and to see where eventually there would be a necessity to be more proactive and set up measures, for example, to make sure that we have access to all the materials we need as well to be able to deliver on this type of scenario. So we will be publishing a study on that probably around the summer or something like that. So yeah, keep in touch, and if you're not registered to a newsletter, then you should, because the information will circulate about that too. So another question, I see a lot of are popping up also. It's a bit difficult to keep up. Okay, maybe I'm not sure, maybe Paul, you can answer this question on electricity demand for district heating generation. It's quite low in our diagram, but we do also consider big heat pumps coming into the system as well. It's just probably they're super efficient, so that's why we don't have so many of them. We don't have a huge power consumption.
Yes, I guess this was on this slide. Well, it's true that the electricity demand in district heating generation remains has a look to remain small on this graph. I think it's that it's still quite increasing, but that this is not really seeable on this graph. But indeed, we do consider the increase of heat pumps for district heating generation.
I think in general, probably that's a question towards our actually partner TEP Energy, who has been modeling the district heating generation and supply for this exercise, mostly because it has mostly to do with the building sector, also a bit in the industry. There will be a follow-up webinar, both actually one for the industry sector and also for the building sector, where there will be a deeper analysis also of the district heating demand and supply. So feel free also to join the as I said webinar, where you will probably get some more insight on this. There was, maybe we can take one or two more questions. There is one question that probably is interesting for a lot of people following the policy debate, especially what is going on right now on hydrogen investments, for example. There is this question of hydrogen readiness. Obviously, we also have modeled parts of the infrastructure also to deliver on hydrogen between the countries and imports, for example, as well. But it's a complicated topic, right? We need to have infrastructure that's hydrogen ready. What does it actually mean in the expert view, so to say? So I'd invite maybe Christopher to comment quickly on this from the side of Artelys, and I can comment on that as well.
Yeah, I think in general in this study we have tried to be conservative in the sense that we have not relied on any kind of silver bullet. But so the technologies that we see in the model, so the hydrogen storage or hydrogen pipelines, are type of infrastructure that are being tested today. So of course, hydrogen pipelines already exist in some areas. Hydrogen storage is being now tested at scale with 100% hydrogen. So we see that a number of technologies are developing, and I think the figures that we show for hydrogen deployment and the need to rely on these technologies is kind of reasonable at the beginning of the pathway, and then we'll have a scale up of the industry after the 2030s. think then there are also some questions when we talk about hydrogen ready, about transitioning from an infrastructure that used to be used for fossil gas towards hydrogen. And there, I think the story is a bit different in the sense that you really have to look asset class by asset class in terms of the repurposing of pipelines, of storages, and of terminals. I think the way or the ease with which they can be then transformed into hydrogen-ready equipment differs quite vastly between these three types of assets.
Yeah, I think there's a quite large discussion currently in Germany as well about power plants that should be also hydrogen ready already by at the latest 2030, and it's a huge discussion. There is actually technically not so much security in the sense that we're not all sure. There is lots of assumptions at this point how much that would cost or how doable this is, but there is a certain risk in currently investing so quickly into hydrogen assets, be it transportation storage assets and also turbines, for example, and without necessarily having the insurance that we're going to be able to run them 100% with hydrogen. I think that's why also we've been quite conservative in this sense. We think there is a big question mark technically. There's a big question mark about the costs. If we follow the results of this modeling exercise here, that's why also we come out with a maximum of direct electrification. It's technologies that we know that we can use in most of the sectors. We can produce heat at quite different levels of heat temperature already today directly with electricity. And we should consider hydrogen to be both costly, but also something that's quite precious. And so we should keep for use cases and applications that really need them the most. And if we could take the time actually to clarify really what does it mean to be hydrogen ready and to make sure the investments are made into assets that can be really converted and used with hydrogen 100% quickly, then we should do so. And the idea is if we directly electrify, we would earn some time as well to clarify those questions without making the investments today and realizing maybe in a few years that some of those assets that we have invested in are not necessarily hydrogen ready, for example. So that's also one of the messages of this study. I would suggest we stop the questions here, the Q&A, and we give it back to Nicola to close down this webinar for today.
Yes, sure. Thanks a lot for the three of you for guiding us through this webinar, and also for the audience to so actively putting questions into the box.